Well, hi, I am Cody Sandahl, and
Blakeley Winslow.
we decided to do this kind of a pastoral biblical conversation, and we were going to try it on Zoom. And technology being technology, it didn't work. So we are doing our best improvisation here, as best we can, as distant as we can. Got a couple windows open to make this as safe as possible, but we are going to bring you this biblical pastoral conversation, improvising the format a little bit here, but nice to be in the sanctuary. And we're looking at Mark chapter 16. So this is going to be kind of a little less formal. We don't have like a specific point we're trying to make. This isn't a prepared sermon. This is us having a pastoral conversation. Blakeley, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and your ministry?
Sure. So I am the director for Christian Challenge, which is a campus ministry at Colorado School of Mines. And I just started working there this fall, actually. And before that, from 2014 up until last spring, I was on staff with the Christian Challenge ministry at CU Boulder. So I have a background in campus ministry, and that's kind of the thing that I'm really passionate about. But I'm also very passionate about the work of the local church. We do a lot of partnerships with local churches, and we always encourage our students to get connected and involved in local church work. And so it's really exciting when I can do things like this that kind of bring some of my worlds together. So
excellent. Well, thanks again for joining me for this, and hopefully it's as fun for you as I know as it will be for me. So why don't you go ahead and read the chapter, Mark chapter 16, and then I'll tell you a little bit about how we came to pick this as our text for this conversation. So take it away.
Okay. Now when the Sabbath was passed, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices that they might come and anoint him. Very early in the morning on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb where the sun had risen. They said among themselves, "Who will roll away the stone from the door of the tomb for us?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away, for it was very large. Entering the tomb, they saw a young man clothed in a long white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they have laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him as he said to you." So they went out quickly and fled from the tomb, for they trembled and they were amazed. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now when he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had cast 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him as they mourned and wept. And when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they did not believe. After that, he appeared in another form to 2 of them as they walked and went into the country. And they went and told it to the rest, but they did not believe them either. Later, he appeared to the 11 as they sat at the table, and he rebuked their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they did not believe those who had seen him after he had risen. And he said to them, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He who believes and is baptized will be saved, but he who does not believe will be condemned. And these signs will follow those who believe. In my name they will cast out demons. They will speak with new tongues. They will take up serpents, and if they drink anything deadly, it will by no means hurt them. They will lay hands on the sick, and they will recover." So then, after the Lord had spoken to them, he was received up into heaven and sat down at the right hand of God. They went out and preached everywhere, the Lord working with them and confirming the word through the accompanying signs. Amen.
And thank you for reading that. So, depending on what kind of Bible people have, especially if it's a more modern translation, like post 1960 or something like that. By the way, what translation are you using?
This is New King James.
New King James, and mine is the English Standard Version over here. And the New King James, does it have the note about the different endings?
It does, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and ESV has it. NRSV, New Revised Standard Version, that's the version that we usually have in our pews. That has a note about it. Most translations post 1950, 1960 will have some note in them about a shorter ending of the Gospel of Mark and a longer ending of the Gospel of Mark. And to kind of let people know. That's what drew us to this text. We thought it might make an interesting conversation that people might not know about. And I was just sharing with Blakeley that I was a Greek TA in seminary, and I spent a lot of time on stuff like this about the different manuscripts. And just to kind of give everyone a little context here, we have these different like scrolls and manuscripts that are discovered or have been preserved. Like the Vatican has this huge library of things in Latin and Greek and Hebrew, so they have this huge library. But there are other things that are discovered as well. And then scholars take these different texts and compare them. And what's the most impressive thing is that like 90% of the time they are word for word, or the differences are unbelievably minimal. Like Jesus Christ versus Christ Jesus, like swapping a word order. And actually in Greek, word order can be a little more fluid. As you compare these things, again, it's impressive how much they agree, but there are some differences, and Mark chapter 16 is one of the biggest differences across these texts. Some of the earliest manuscripts actually end with verse 8, which says, and they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So some texts end it right there. A few other texts have a couple extra verses that are kind of a quick ending and summary, and then a lot of manuscripts that are the best guess is that they're a little they appeared a little later. So maybe like in the 200s or 300s, those texts have this longer ending, whereas the ones from the like late 100s, early 200s don't have this ending. And there's kind of different ways to think about that, and scholars don't have a 100% agreement. But do you go with the earliest texts as being closest to the source? Most of those don't have the long ending. Or some of the later ones have it, but they have internal agreement. So those texts agree with each other really, really, really closely. So things like this longer ending of the Gospel of Mark, if all these texts found all over the Mediterranean area have it almost exactly, the same, is that right? Or is it the ones that were written earlier, closer to when Jesus was alive? So that's kind of the debate that goes on. And how we kind of got here, the King James was put together by a guy named Erasmus, and he, with the best stuff that he had, some of the texts that we now have, he didn't know about at that time, but the texts that he had all had this longer ending in it. So that's kind of how it became tradition for the longer ending of the Gospel of Mark to be a part of the English language translations, is the King James used that. And again, there's still a debate about that. So what scholars do today is they make this division and they kind of give you both versions. So what we'll be talking about is, why, one of the things we'll be talking about is why this, what might it mean, for the Gospel of Mark to have ended at 8? What would that have meant? Or what about the rest of this? We'll kind of talk about that division along with some other things that are going on in the text. So that's kind of frames what's going on here. And remember, the manuscripts have these minor differences. They're so close to the same. I think it's miraculous how similar they are. If we had a conversation together and then tried to write it down afterward from memory, we would get nowhere close to the same. And that's what they were doing a lot of the times. And they were able to get these so close. So I think that's the most impressive thing to remember, is how close all these different texts are. But there are some differences that we're going to focus on one of those today.
Yeah, I would agree. Just first and foremost, anytime you have these textual variants, there's always this kind of worry, was some meaning changed? And the fact that throughout centuries, God's word has been preserved with so much accuracy. I mean, you're going to go back to things like the Dead Sea Scrolls and see, copies of manuscripts thousands of years before the time of Jesus, and how well they've been preserved. And so, I think that's one of the biggest things. But one interesting thing to me, Cody, let's just take the manuscript that ends at verse 8. And, I remember when I first heard about this, I thought, gosh, this seems really kind of abrupt. We're kind of left hanging, okay? We hear the news that Jesus has risen from the dead, and then the women basically don't know what to do. They leave, and it says they don't tell anyone, they're afraid. And I remember talking about this actually in a seminary class, and one of my professors had a really interesting perspective. He kind of likened it to, they're not as popular maybe nowadays, but in the old movie serials and TV shows, there was always the cliffhanger, right? The action would end abruptly, and you would basically have to tune in to the next program to see what was going to happen. And this is almost like a biblical version of the cliffhanger. But what's really interesting is I think it's a cliffhanger with a twist, because I think when Mark is writing this, he's almost wanting us to be uncomfortable. He's wanting us to think, wait a minute, the story can't end this way. It can't end this abruptly. Jesus is risen. What are the women going to do? Are they not going to tell anyone what's going to happen? And I think what he really wants is for us to put ourselves into that story and think, what would I do? What would I do if I'd showed up at the tomb on that first Easter Sunday morning, had not seen Jesus there, had been told by an angel that he was risen, and had been told to go and spread that news? Would I have gone out and immediately done that? Would I have been fearful? Would I have been uncertain? And so I think what the brilliance to me, or the genius of this particular text, is that it forces us to kind of think about that question. What would we do in a similar situation? Because we know the story can't end that way. There's a disconnect, but it raises the question, how would we have reacted if we put ourselves into the place of those women and think if we were in a similar situation? And then, of course, when you get verses 9 through 20, that kind of fills out the context. But I always kind of like, every time I read through chapter 16, I like to stop at verse 8 and think, okay, what if that was the end of the gospel? Would that maybe even give me a little extra motivation to kind of think, even all of these thousands of years later, you and me and all the followers of Jesus, we're kind of finishing this story because we're taking up that same challenge that the angel gave us. Hey, Jesus is risen. Nothing's ever going to be the same again, but are you going to go and share that? Is that going to become real for you? Is that going to become something that motivates you to go out and spread the good news about Christ? So that's kind of the way that I look at it, ending at verse 8.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I sometimes think about, if you have a good story to tell, or if you met someone famous, are you just going to not tell anyone? My brother loves to tell stories, and one of his stories was at a hotel. He saw someone that he thought was the basketball player Charles Barkley, and he was confident enough that he bought a drink to send over there. Didn't go over and talk to him, and the waiter confirmed that it was Charles Barkley. If you don't follow basketball, Hall of Famer and TV analyst, very famous. And Charles Barkley, gave him the wave. That's the story. That my brother bought a drink for Charles Barkley from a distance, but he tells it, right? And so, in the same way, like if you have this, an amazing encounter, you're going to share it.
Yeah.
So I love this kind of implied cliffhanger, like you're talking about. Also, like the Gospel of Mark is, we believe, the oldest of the Gospels, that it was written again closest to the time of Jesus, and there were probably first generation people here that all the stuff that happened after this, most of them lived it. So right. they knew, like, this was written for an audience, right? It wasn't just written for someone to discover later. Like, this was written for actual people, that they obviously knew that it didn't end there, right, because they had received the gospel. But I love that implication of what are you going to do about it? And also there are other ancient texts that kind of end very abruptly, or don't cover some of the details you think they should. For instance, we all, if you know the Iliad and Achilles and the death of Achilles and right, their battling against Troy, it's not actually in the Iliad. It's implied. It's talked about, but the actual events of Achilles dying are never narrated. Right. We see it in movies and plays, things like that, but it's not actually in there. So there's a lot of precedent in ancient texts to either end very abruptly or to not talk about some of the details that you think should be talked about.
Right. Right. And another thing that's interesting too, Cody, like if you look at verse 11 and then again in verse 13, we start to see this theme coming out that, the women go and tell others, but they're not believed. Then Jesus appears to two men on the road. This may be a reference to the Luke story, the road to Emmaus. But same thing, they go and tell others and they don't believe. So the initial reaction of the women in some ways almost foreshadows or prefigures this continuing theme that as much as and I think this is true in our own hearts too, there's times as much as we want to believe that Jesus really has risen and has changed the world, there's still that part of our flesh that thinks, gosh, can a man really come back from the dead? Is this really possible? And I have no doubt my reaction, even if I had lived and walked with Jesus, would probably have been similar. If someone had come and told me, hey, he's risen from the dead, you're not going to believe it, I would have thought, wait a minute, right? Is this really true?
Yeah, especially because they weren't expecting it. That's throughout all the Gospels you see where Jesus tries to explain that, on the third day he will rise again, and they have no idea what he's talking about. And like the bodily personal resurrection of the Messiah was not an expected thing. Jesus was so unexpected, he fulfilled all the prophecies about the Messiah, but in unexpected ways. And so they weren't looking for their Messiah to bodily, personally rise again from the dead. That was shocking to them, and it wasn't part of. You can go back and see it. But they, at the time, the best scholars weren't. That wasn't part of the deal.
Right.
So it's understandable that they wouldn't believe it.
Yeah, and it's almost non-belief on two sides, because you can think the women maybe on the one hand are struggling to accept it themselves, but then I think there's also that fear. Is anyone going to believe me? Even if I really believe this, and you especially think about the status that women had in society at that time, I believe if they went into a legal situation, like in a court situation, I don't even think their word could be considered reliable testimony to back up a legal assertion or case. And yet here, just one of these wonderful ways that God works, who were the first people entrusted with the greatest news ever? It's these women, but I'm sure going through their mind is anyone actually going to believe us? Or are they just going to be like, y'all were hysterical, you imagined this couldn't have really happened? I'm sure they're struggling with that too. And again, that's something I can still relate to now, because, even when we are convicted of what Jesus is doing in our life, there's always that voice in the back of their head that says, yeah, but is anyone else really going to buy that? Is anyone else really going to believe your stories about what Jesus is doing in your life?
Yeah, and that's a kind of a couple different things on that, for like personal application. One of the interesting things in the Gospel of Mark throughout it is how many times Jesus tells someone, don't tell anyone.
Yeah.
And then they go and do tell people, right? It's because, hey, I had leprosy. I no longer have leprosy. He told me not to tell anyone, but I got to tell you about this. Look, my skin's not white, right? Yeah. It's kind of obvious. And all throughout the Gospel of Mark, Jesus tells people, don't tell anyone. And then they do. And then here, they're supposed to tell people,
right?
And they don't. I mean, how ironic. So maybe instead of like telling people that they should like tell others about their faith, don't tell anyone. Never again. Don't. We'll see if this reverse psychology works.
Right.
And like for us, I love that. That thought process of what is our story to tell, and who should we be telling? That kind of cliffhanger approach. That's maybe something for us to think about. We talked about that in our church a bit, about like we had that class about knowing your gospel, being able to tell your story, and everyone got off the hook. I said I was going to call them in 6 months to check if they had actually done it right before COVID-19 hit. So they all got off the hook, and maybe next year I'll give them 6 more months. We'll see. But I think that's whenever we share our faith, we grow. Yeah. Can you think of any examples or stories of that from either yourself or your ministry?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's funny, Cody, because even though I've been working in ministry for a while, I remember when I got into campus ministry, I started kind of thinking about the college campus as a mission field. And I, honestly, especially at CU Boulder, there's a lot of fear in my heart at first, because I thought, people here are so secular. There's so many students here who kind of have their own idea already about what they want to do spiritually, or even if they have no interest spiritually. And there are some barriers that I had to overcome, I think, in my own heart, in my own mind, because I actually have come to find that college campus is one of the greatest mission fields. It's one of the best opportunities you will ever have to find people who are interested in exchanging ideas. They're interested in sharing about themselves. There's an openness in general with college students, even though for the most part, on the campuses I've been here, at least in Colorado, there's a kind of a prevailing secular attitude. But so one of the things that we tried to do with our students, we've always encouraged building relationships that can lead to evangelistic opportunities, but we've also encouraged what you could call, I guess, contact, or sometimes we call it discovery evangelism. That's where you just get out and you talk to people that you've never met before. And we used to do that on a regular basis at CU. We're going to be hopefully doing more of that at Mines as the COVID situation improves. But that was always kind of a scary experience, but it was also really cool because you're kind of putting yourself out there to see what God is going to do. You're going up to someone, seeing if they have any interest in having a spiritual conversation, asking some questions. But yeah, definitely for me, I had one of those kind of moments at the beginning where I had to kind of overcome some of my own kind of fears and reluctance, kind of thinking, oh, is this really good? Is this kind of direct approach even going to kind of work with people? But one thing that I feel like has been true again and again in my life and experience with sharing with others is that people in general are more willing to hear a lot of times than we are to talk about our faith. We kind of shut that conversation down in our mind a lot of times before it even happens. And it's kind of like God told Moses in Exodus. Moses is giving him all these excuses about how he can't speak. And God's like, well, who has made man's mouth? Who makes the mute or the deaf or the blind? Have not I, the Lord? And if you go, I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall say. And that's been my experience as well. That God gives us the words to say in those moments, but sometimes the real battle is kind of with ourselves to begin with, because people actually are willing to hear. But we have to get to the point where we have overcome some of our fears and hang-ups to be willing to go out and start sharing with people.
I'm curious, do you, for your students, do you tell them if they're doing that kind of, that kind of, the people that they haven't met before?
Yeah.
Do you tell them to identify that they're part of a ministry, or just, how do they start off their conversation?
Yeah. A lot of times I will tell them just up front, because sometimes that's the most awkward part of the conversation, honestly, because you always sort of get that look from someone like, why is this stranger coming over to talk to me? So I will tell them to identify as being part of a campus ministry, and that kind of breaks the ice. That kind of lets someone know, okay, this is sort of the general intent or initial objective of this conversation. But then I really encourage them, after they've kind of gotten that little first part out of the way, to be ready to listen, because I think too often, particularly maybe even in a college campus setting, what students are used to is someone coming and saying they want a conversation, but actually what they want is a monologue. They want to just completely indoctrinate that student for the next 10 or 15 minutes, everything they know about Jesus. And I know they're coming from a good place, their heart's in the right place, but that will turn a lot of people off. As opposed to me coming up and saying, yeah, I'm with the campus ministry, I have a couple of questions I'd like to ask you, but really what's in my heart first and foremost is I want to hear about your worldview. I want to hear if you have any sort of experience with God. What does the name Jesus, what sort of connotations does that even bring to mind? And then my response is going to some extent be based on what you say. Of course, there are certain things about my faith that are kind of constants that I want to be able to share, but I'm also going to base my response on where I hear you kind of coming from spiritually. And so we have to listen first to get to that point, I think.
Yeah, I love that kind of listening posture, instead of I am going to win this conversation, right?
Right.
Try that with your spouse, right? Come into a conversation thinking, I'm going to win this conversation. It's not going to go well. I can just about guarantee you. In the same way, it's, I kind of think about the word that we use for gospel comes from Greek euangelion, which it literally means good news.
Right.
And to be able to tell someone good news, I think you have to understand where their life is. And sometimes if you understand someone's bad news, then you understand where Jesus's good news breaks through. But if you're just kind of trying to be generic good news, it kind of can fall flat. So, and also Jesus didn't appear in the clouds and deliver to all of us, this is the good news of Jesus Christ, me, listen to me, right? That's not how it happened. It happened in relationship.
Right.
And that Jesus came down in the person. So
Absolutely.
I love that kind of incarnating relational approach. Even if you haven't met someone before, you can start with a listening posture. I think that's really good.
And I actually think it helps relieve some of the nervousness too, because I know the times that I've been most nervous doing evangelism is when I felt like I kind of had all these things I had to remember to talk about or to ask about. I kind of had a program in mind. But if I come in more with the idea I'm going to listen first, I actually can feel myself relaxing, because I say basically the little prayer I always say before evangelism is God, this is going to have to be on you. I'm going to forget exactly what I need to say, and I want to make sure that I'm listening well. And so I'm trying to kind of clear my mind as much as possible in those moments, and I just want to focus on listening and then trusting that the Holy Spirit is going to give me the responses at the right time. But it's actually kind of liberating because you don't feel like you're coming in preparing to speak. You're kind of keeping an open heart and an open mind, and you want to hear what that other person's going to say, and then you're praying that God is going to give you wisdom to know how to respond to that. Again, as opposed to kind of coming in, this is my program, this is what I want to say, regardless of what I hear from this other person. So each conversation ends up being really different, but I like that about it. That's part of the exciting aspect of it, I guess, and trusting God. It's not this formula. I think sometimes evangelism is presented to us as a formulaic type exercise, and that to me actually causes more stress if I have to view it that way. Yeah. If that makes sense,
Yeah, like having a conversation. It's like, oh, hold on, I got to check my notes here. And,
right.
Oh, sorry, I missed
it also
the point.
ruins the spontaneity, doesn't it? Yeah. It's kind of hard to keep up the natural pretext if you're so tied to the approach that you want to have and kind of your formula. So
yeah, I kind of think of it as having like a conversation with a person who's on a spiritual journey.
Yep.
And that conversation is that back and forth, and they're on a spiritual journey. Find out what that is. Right. And where Jesus intersects that.
Right. And one other thing I would add is I read a really good book a few years ago called God's Space by a guy named Doug Pollock. And basically his whole theme in the book is that one of the most important things we can do in evangelism is not, again, know what we should say, but know one or two really good questions to ask. And if you ask the right questions, people will almost always tell you the other kinds of things that you're wanting to know without you having to do so much probing. And so it's really... I've really found that to be true also. And sometimes even just leaving a person with a really good question can do more. God can do more to work on their heart with that than me talking for 10 or 15 minutes of just uninterrupted kind of, this is all the things I believe. Leaving them with a question that kind of they have to ponder and they have to think about can sometimes be really effective too. I know you've done that before in some of your messages.
Yeah.
And it's been really effective.
Well, and if the Gospel of Mark did end in verse 8 with that cliffhanger, then you're just doing what Mark did.
Yeah, that's right.
Leave them thinking. Leave them thinking.
Right.
Leave them wanting more. Don't give them everything.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, another thing that kind of sticks out to me, which is a theme in all the Gospels, and you touched on it earlier about how women were, they weren't even viewed as witnesses, reliable witnesses in court, is that the Christmas story. Christmas is coming up, and the first, Mary and Joseph are a nothing couple from a nothing town, and they weren't in the halls of power, or when the wise men came, they went to Jerusalem and to the king, and and the news of God wasn't there. And who did the angels appear to? Shepherds, who were viewed with great distrust. And then here, the first people to receive this message, or in other Gospels, the first people to actually see the risen Christ are women, who are the last people you would want to entrust a shocking, unbelievable story because they weren't believed. So that's kind of a theme throughout the Gospels, and we see it in the text, is that sometimes Jesus is most present with the people that we are most likely to ignore. Yeah. And I think that's something like during this time, there's a lot of us are worked up about big picture things. Yeah. And with good cause. Like there's a lot of turmoil, a lot of things are uncertain right now. But I think for me personally, this reminded me that some of the most important lessons that I have learned in my faith and in my life have actually come in my encounters with people that would be written off. Some of the hardest things I've heard about myself have come, when I've been open to those conversations. Right. Some of the best examples of faithfulness. I mean, one of the people that I have known for a long time is one of the most faithful givers. Never has any money, but percentage-wise, what she's willing to give. Yeah. It's kind of like the widow's mite, right? That she only had a couple of pennies, but out of her need, gave that. Some of those examples, some of the most powerful examples of the gospel in people's lives, I have witnessed in encounters with people who are not in the halls of power, don't impact even the big story of a church. Yeah. And so that's, for me, during this time when I think we're all thinking about big stuff, maybe that's also a reminder to look in the smallest of places Or like, Elijah, when he went wanting to encounter God, and God said, I'll be there. And it wasn't in the earthquake, and it wasn't in the wind, it wasn't in the fire, it was in the sound of sheer silence.
Yeah.
Or the still small voice. So that's maybe an encouragement, I think, is to seek the still small voice during this time of big turmoil.
Right.
Look in the small.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really, I really agree with you pointed out, because Mark does that a lot. I was just thinking back in Mark 5, really one of the first kind of missionaries we see in Scripture is the most unlikely person you could imagine. He's a guy who's been possessed by demons, who've been living in tombs, self-mutilating, running around completely crazy. Everyone was afraid of him. This guy ends up going out and starting to tell other people about Jesus, to the point that when Jesus comes back into that same region later, there are crowds waiting to see him and waiting to follow him. So this man, who was, the most outcast you could be in a society, becomes one of the first missionaries that we see, mentioned in Scripture. And then, like you said, the women, I mean, the fact that Jesus appears to them first, I think is really significant. Something else I was just looking that I think is kind of cool is he appears, and it's this great, amazing moment, right? Like, changes history, spiritually, everything. But he still is thinking about individuals at the same time as he's, this resurrection is for all of us, right? But he says specifically, go and tell the disciples and Peter. And I think that's such a kind of a touching moment, because Jesus has on his mind that Peter's hurting. Peter's probably at a low ebb right now because he denied him. And Jesus is thinking specifically about Peter and how he's going to restore him. Even in this moment when he's coming back, finishing the redemption of the whole universe, he still has individual people on his mind. And I think that just shows what an amazing God we have. He works in the grand and in these sublime ways, but he also works in each individual life and in each individual heart.
I was just having this conversation with my 5-year-old a couple days ago. We were reading a Star Wars comic, and then all of a sudden he asks, "Why can't I see God?" And I was trying to kind of tell him that it's like, well, God's inside of us. But the cool thing about that is, that God is so transcendent, he can be so immanent. I didn't use those words with him.
Right.
But, that God is so big that God can be so small to all of us simultaneously. We can have this one-on-one conversation, but that means I'm not having that conversation with all these other people.
Right.
But God can be personally present to all of us simultaneously. So God's bigness, that's a word, right?
Yeah.
God's enormity allows God to encounter us in the most personal way possible, but each of us simultaneously. And that's something that I think is useful for us to think about, again, with all this, all of our big thoughts, but also that God cares about even the smallest things in our lives. It doesn't have to just be people. God doesn't just care about people who are dying. God doesn't just care about people who are suffering. God doesn't just care about the people who are having the top 10% worst days in humanity today. No,
right. God
cares about your day. Even if it's a small thing that annoys you, God still cares about that in the same way that a parent, if my 5-year-old has something happen to him at back when he went to school, when he had something at school, I still want to hear about his day, even if it's something really small. In the same way, God cares about those little details. Like you said, tell the disciples and Peter. I think that's a marvelous good news for us.
Exactly. Yeah. And another interesting thing, Cody, reading this passage again, the very methods that God chooses, I think, are often an illustration or an example for us to follow. Because Jesus obviously could have just appeared at the tomb. Why does he send an angel? Well, I think it's to even get the example put out there of the angel's a messenger come from God. He's telling the women about Jesus. Now they're going to go and be asked to do the same thing. And of course, it's a test of their faith too, but I think even just the process of saying the angel's coming and telling, now he's saying, you go and tell, and it's going to kind of set off this chain reaction. The disciples are going to hear it from the women. They're going to start going and telling others. So it's almost like God wanted to start modeling that from the beginning. He could have just sort of appeared, here's Jesus, okay, you all see him, but that whole aspect of sending a messenger, are you going to believe the messenger that's coming with this good news? I think maybe that was intentional on God's part to sort of set that example up for us.
Yeah, if the medium is the message, then here relationships are the medium.
Right. Yeah. And so much is, yeah, exactly, the relationship. So much, like we were talking about earlier, is the women's word going to be believed? Is there trust there? It's almost like Jesus is saying, look, if I can't even have trust within my little band of followers here, how are you ever going to go out and start to change the world with this message? Should they have to learn even within themselves to overcome some of that faith and doubt? Here's someone from within my own small community who's sharing this good news with me. Am I going to believe them? Am I going to trust their word? Do I have the faith to do that?
Yeah.
So
yeah, I have no idea how long we've been going here.
Probably.
So we'll bring it to
time.
a close. I'll end with one comment because snake handling comes from the ending here. Because talking about the pickup snakes and Ivan. And if you look through this list, these are things largely you'll see these in the Book of Acts. So I think it's Paul, right? Paul on the island of Malta gets bitten by a poisonous snake, and then he tosses it aside, and all the locals are like waiting for him to die. Right? He's not dying. Did he really get bitten by that snake? He's not dead yet. What's going on here? So like that was an actual thing that happened, is how I would take that, rather than let's all go pick up snakes.
yeah. Well, I guess there's the whole symbolic thing too. I mean, it's really cool. Even if you go back to Genesis, there's the prophecy that the serpent's head is going to be crushed by the woman's offspring, which is, of course, Jesus. And so I sort of see this in a symbolic way too, taking up in other words, we're going to be able to take Satan, even at his strong points, through the power of Christ, and he's not going to be able to stand against us.
And we'll use that as a closing point. So the good news is that whatever you're experiencing, whatever serpent is going on right now, the power of Christ prevails and can crush the serpent's head. So hopefully through this you've learned a few things and maybe picked up a few ideas of maybe read through the Gospel of Mark yourself, the chapter 16, and think where is God speaking to me? Where is Jesus? The good news of Jesus encountering me right now, and again, it might be something really small. And don't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone. Whatever you don't, we're going to try this reverse psychology. Don't tell anyone about it. Well, thanks, Blakeley.
Thank you, Cody. It's been a real pleasure.
And we'll do this again sometime.